आओ जी आओ जी आओ जी
We're going to be discussing the influences of the British Raj on Punjabi attire and textiles as we look at Jaswinder Kaur's beautiful book full of rich photographs and illustrations. British influence is more than evident in our education, in our lifestyles, our aesthetic, our homes, our clothes, for both men and women. And this impact was first concentrated among the royals and the so-called upper classes. But gradually it trickled down to everyone. And so we started to see everyone sporting more, clothes which were different, clothes which sort of were combinations of features from European clothes or from English modes of dress, combining them with Indian clothes. And also the fact of having specific clothes for specific occasions, or changing your clothes for sports and for leisure or for a formal dinner. All of these things are part and parcel of our lives today, so much so that we don't really pay any attention to it. But how did all of this happen? And what is the fascinating history behind all of these trends? What was imported and what was made in India? And then with the independence movement and Gandhi, Swadeshi, Khadi, how did things change again? This intersection between history, political movements, and the impact on society and the making of popular culture is absolutely riveting. Today, we're going to listen to the history of what we wear. And our author today is a textile expert, Jaswinder Kaur, who uses cloth to tell the history of Punjab. Her father was also in politics, a very renowned figure in India. And I'd like to welcome Jaswinder here today on the Maja House platform. She has been doing consultancies and assignments with world-renowned prestigious textile and ethnographic museums and institutions in Switzerland. And she's written and researched extensively on this subject. In conversation with her today is Dr. Alka Pandey, consultant, art advisor, and curator, Visual Arts Gallery, India Habitat Center. Alka is an art historian who taught art and aesthetics at Punjab University for more than 10 years. She's been felicitated with a number of prestigious honors, including the Knight of the Order of Arts and Letters by the French government and the Australia-India Council Special Award. She's also been given the Amrita Shergill Samman and various other honors. She's authored books on Indian aesthetics, on culture, on spirituality, and on the representation of the body in art and Indian art and sculpture. A very, very warm welcome to both of you, and look forward to seeing you in person in Maja House when we finally open up again. Jaswinder and Alka, welcome, and welcome to all the audience who's here with us today. And over to you now, Alka, to take the conversation forward.
So from Maja House, a big sasrikal and hello to everybody. Thank you, Preeti, for organizing this very interesting conversation about fabric. Fabric has always been a very, very important component of Indian consciousness, culture, and even our independence movement, where it was all about Swadeshi. Thank you, Arvinder Singh Chamakji, for being here, and Gina for doing all the logistics and balancing the back end. I know I'm forgetting a few names, but when the thank yous will be done by my colleague, I think he will make it all up to the people I've forgotten. But I will now continue to talk about fabric and also to welcome the author, Jaswinder Kaurji, to the program today. I'm delighted to be in conversation with her. Clothing has always fascinated me, not because we are all very vain Indians, and as women, we all love to dress up. but also because for a number of years, I taught the history of Indian clothing at the National Institute of Fashion Technology in Mohali to a lot of young fashion students there. In fact, for more than 15 years, I was teaching the subject. And what was interesting is that Indian clothing is also like an onion. You unravel one layer and another peel emerges. And what is very, very interesting for me is that this is probably the first book of its kind, which is looking at the British influence on the attire and textiles of a certain moment in the history of Punjab. And Punjab is also, in any case, one of the most interesting states of India. It was known as the guardian of India because most of the invasions which took place in India came through the Punjab. And that is what makes Punjab so very interesting as well, because this is the beauty of the wonder that is India, that we've had a lot of invaders coming in through the Northwest frontier provinces, as we call them. Very few people came by sea. The people who came by sea were those who came for trading and commerce. And of course, there was a lot of cross-cultural influences which came in, whether it was the dhows which came into the port of Calicut many, many centuries ago, or whether it was the Pallav and Chola influences, which went on to what you call pan-Indian influence in Cambodia and what you call it, the Near East and the Far East, whether it was Buddhism, which went as far as Japan. And with that, a lot of clothing and attire also went, as the traditions of dance and music as well. But I'm going to quickly go back to Punjab once again. And what we see in, or which comes in through Punjab, is very, very interesting. I'm just going to rewind a little bit before I go to Jaswinder and we talk about her work. I just want to give a little bit of an idea of how we as Indians dressed. For a long time, whether it was the Aryabharta or the Indus Valley civilization, what we see is that Indians did not wear stitched clothing for a long, long time. We wore drapes. It was all about the draping and the unstitched. In fact, the evidences of stitched clothing do not come to us before the first century or the second century before the Common Era, when you have Kanishka wearing a pair of stitched garment, a kind of a coat and boots with it. Otherwise, what the Indians wore was uttariya, which was a covering on top, an antariya, which we wore below, and a kind of a lower garment, which both men and women draped around and was held together by a mekhla or a kamarband. So this was the kind of clothing we wore. But what we see is over a period of time, with the coming in, and I don't know exactly who to pinpoint really, but I would say the Central Asians, the Arabs which came in, who came on horseback. Now, horse too was a foreign animal. It was not indigenous to India as the elephant was. So when the horses came and people came sitting cross-legged over the, with their feet on either side of the horse, they wore a different kind of clothing. And the precursor to the Punjabi shalwar was the suttan, which people kind of draped and, literally the women wore it like a loin cloth and it was like a pair of trousers. So what is very, really interesting to note is that slowly over a period of time, and you will have evidences in the caves of Khandagiri and Udaygiri in Odisha, you have it in the murals and the frescoes at Ajanta and Bagh and Badami. This is after the, what you call the golden epoch or the bell epoch, or the golden period of the Gupta period, which is about the 4th or 5th century after the Common Era, that the stitched and the structured clothing was very much part of the Indian costuming. And if we kind of trace the history of Indian clothing, we do it through painting and we do it through sculpture. So whether it is the the Kakatiyas that you see in the deep south, whether it is the Chola period, whether it is the Lepakshi temple in Andhra Pradesh, or you look at the beautiful sculptures that you see in Odisha, where you see musicians and dancers wearing lovely attire, and the paintings, particularly the medieval period, when you see the miniature tradition, the Mughal paintings, the Rajput paintings, the Pahadi, or what you also know as the delicate Kangra kalam. What do you see are beautiful fabrics. They are woven, they are dyed, they are block printed, and of course, the enormous amount of embroideries or kashidas that we have in our country. And it's against this backdrop that Jaswinder has looked at the clothing which she has seen the British influence on the indigenous clothing of India. What is also interesting to note is that, as Preeti said a few minutes ago, that clothing was something which broke a lot of boundaries. And in India, as we all know, it is a fact of life that we, for a long time, will not be able to go over class and caste. Now, with clothing, what you see is that what you see with clothing is that caste still hasn't been able to be erased, but definitely. And the British influence is more about the working class and the non-working class, or perhaps we'd call it the zamindaris or the landed gentry, the royalty and the upper classes. And it is here that we see a huge amount of influence of the British that you see. I'm now going to actually invite Jaswinder to make a presentation of her work so that all of you can get your toes wet through her visual journey, which is a very, very personal journey. And once you've seen the kind of clothing that she has chosen and why she's chosen that, then we'll come back into a conversation. But I wanted to just give this kind of landscape against which the clothing of Punjab sees a visual language. So welcome, Jaswinder, and I'd like you to make your presentation.
Thank you, Alka. I want to thank first Preeti and Maja House, the entire team of Maja House for having me here. And thank you to Alka for being here. Now I'll show you the first slide. The first slide is my cover. The left is the front cover and the back is the right is the back cover. Now the front cover is very typical of where a variety of Western wear is worn by the family. Then there are coats by the younger people and shoes by the entire family. Although women did not wear the Western attire, but their influences are seen in their shoes, in the use of laces, and there are many, many other things later we'll discuss. And the gentleman is, of course, wearing a nachkan and a churidar pajama. And on right is the various embroideries that were there and the textiles of Punjab. Then the next slide shows, the next slide is a gentleman with a stick. Now this was very common for people around early 20th century for men to first start wearing Western garments. As a process of Westernization, they first adapted a garment along with their Indian clothes. Here the gentleman is wearing like an overcoat, but they could be wearing a coat, overcoat, waistcoat, and it was common for them to be wearing it with their kurta and a pajama. But here the gentleman is wearing it with a shirt-like collar and a tie. The next, please. Now, here the process of Westernization, taking the process of Westernization forward. Here, the young boys and the gentlemen are all wearing coats. Some of them are wearing Western suits, and many are wearing ties. But there are a couple of men who are still in their pajamas. So this kind of mixed dressing up was very common. Next, please. Now, as Westernization spread, and it was the Maharajas and the upper class who adopted the Western clothes first, their lifestyles also changed. Maharajas added wings and palaces, new palaces to suit their lifestyle. And along with the palaces came different kind of activities like the aristocracy in England was used to. A common program, like The Crown, which beautifully depicts the early aristocracy of early 20th century, where they show royalty wearing different clothes for riding, for playing tennis or socializing in the evening. Here is a picture or a painting of Maharaja Rajinder Singh of Patiala. And this is probably end 19th century. He was very fond of riding, and he's in his riding attire. And he lost his life in a riding accident. Now the next slide is a new garment that had evolved called the achkan or the sherwani. The achkan or sherwani has elements of both English as well as Indian dress or costume. The length is taken from Indian jamas or chogas and garkha, and the upper part and the buttons are from the Western coat. Now the bankala, which we very gladly adopted as our national dress, part of our national dress, is really derived from officers' uniforms. Next, please. Now this is 1946, which just a year before we got our independence. And the mixed style of dressing is very evident here. Now, these are legislators who are newly elected members of the interim government which was formed. And there you can see mixed style of achkan with pajama. Then there are coats worn with kurta and pajama. And of course, there are Western suits worn with a shirt and a tie. Next, please. Now here is a favorite style of mine are the women. Now women, although were not affected very drastically by the Western wear, they were not visually affected, they did not change their dress per se, and most of them did not take up Western garments, though there was a small percentage of people from royalty, upper class royalty or Christian community that did wear some amount of European garments. But they were affected in other ways. The manner of tying the sari is derived from the Western women's dresses of the period, Then then they started wearing accessories like coats and using makeup, and were affected by using materials. And on the right side, we see a lady she's attired with attire. She's got a lot of lace on her clothing, and she also has a brooch. Next, please. Now this is a kurta, and this is part of an ensemble, a kurta and a waistcoat worn on it. On the left is a kurta, which is made of velvet. Now, velvet is part of the material that came from abroad and was imported by the British. Velvet was always a rich textile, which was very expensive during the Mughal times, and other royalty used it. However, during Industrial Revolution, they made velvet which was easily accessible to people, and it reduced the cost. So there a lot of velvet was imported into India and into Punjab, and this ensemble is made by that with velvet. It's a green velvet, although the color is not very visible. Now, on the left side, after the First World War, women's attire in Europe were adopted a lot of men's clothing from men's elements from men's clothing. Like on the left there, you can see the collar, the front of the shirt, like front opening and cuffs. Now this was also there in the women's clothing in Europe. And on the right is a newer garment, which was called a waistcoat. Waistcoat is directly borrowed from men's garment, though it has been stylized and with the embroidery to suit the women's needs of being or wearing ornate fabric. See, it has the U of the men's waistcoat, and it is exactly, you can see the strips at the back to tighten the waistcoat. So all these are derived, and the slit pockets. Now, pocket watches were very, very popular in early 20th century before they gave up wearing after the war, First World War. They stopped wearing pocket watches because around that time the cars had come in and people found it more cumbersome to use a pocket watch, and they started wearing wrist watches. But the popularity of the pocket watch is depicted here. Now in the next slide. Now this is the most favorite slide of all Punjabis. And this box is contained a loose powder, which was very popular in Punjab, and almost everyone, whether from a rural background or a urban background, used this. And I had a lot of people comment on this, that they had seen their grandmother with this box or their mother with this box. So I thought I'll include this part of also cosmetics which were used. Now the next following slides are the embroidery or handiwork. This is called the Suti Style. Now, just to mention, there were three more popular styles, most popular styles in early 20th century. By 1910, they had started using the Suti embroidery, which in this case, they are all basically cross-stitch embroideries, but they were done on a particular cloth called the Suti cloth. Now, Baden-Powell in 1872 mentions different types of cloths. They were, if it was one yarn was woven, it was called ek suti. If two together were woven, it was called do suti or the suti. Then teen suti, char suti, etc. So this particular fabric had two yarns woven together, which gave it kind of a little more visibility of the yarns and easy for women to count the embroideries. And just to mention another thing as to why women started embroidering these Western style of embroideries is because as Westernization grew, then European style furniture entered people's homes and in Punjab. And with the furniture came the use of household linen, the use of household linen like table linen, sofa back covers, angithi posh, maize posh, and palang posh and things like that. So since the availability, and then there are many inventions of these kind of table linen being used only by Europeans by end of 19th century, which has been mentioned by many writers. But as Westernization grew and women started using more of these household linen, the need arose for them to make their own articles and using Western style embroideries. By this time, the magazines and the designs had also started coming into the market. Next, please. Now, this is a second style on the right side called the bharvi. Bharvi literally means the filling stitch or to fill. Now, the left is an iron-on transfer, which had started, iron-on transfers, which had started coming into the market. Iron-on transfers came on the principle or worked on the principle they had low melting point, and when they were kept on an article or a cloth and used an iron over it, the low melting point of the material that was attached to it, they made a design onto the cloth which made easy for women to copy. So a lot of iron-on transfers came in and women started using these, as is evident from the one on the right side, which was also made by an iron-on transfer. Now it is most interesting to note that this design or the pattern called the Crinoline pattern was derived from the dresses, European dresses of the period. This Crinoline period was there from 1850 to 1869. And what is amazing is that although in the West, women stopped wearing these kind of these kind of dresses, but for over 50 years in Punjab, women continued to make these kind of embroideries with this design. Next, please. Now, this is another example of bharvi, and it has, cut work and bharvi mixed this is done by a aristocratic lady from 1920s, and done as a trousseau for her daughter. See, along with the traditional embroideries like kulkari and other textiles like case or daris, women, after they started making these embroideries, they started adding these kind of embroideries as trousseau items for their daughters. Then they had also for their pillowcases and sheets embroidered things like sweet dreams, good night, welcome, which I'm sure everyone from Punjab have seen it on for their grandmothers or mothers, items which they had made. Next, please. Now, this is a white work, another style, you can say. But white work was very popular in Europe in 19th century. It was done on their both in the churches and in palaces. Here, white work, there are different types of white work I have shown. On the left top is a pillow cover, which was done by my mother. And after it had worn out, has following the techniques of drawn thread work and pulled work. The drawn thread work means you draw out a few threads and then work on with generally stitches so that they don't come apart. And the pulled work is where the fabric is pulled and the thread is not drawn. So let me continue with this story, that on the left, after this pillow cover was worn out, it was used as a dusting cloth, and which I retrieved after a long time from my parents' house in Jalandhar. Now on the bottom is also white work where all the elements are white, and it follows drawn thread work, bit of cut work. And in this, a little in the center, little big part of the fabric is cut out and it is filled with crochet work. On the right is net work, which is done with applique network. Next, please. Now, the third most popular handwork, I'll say it's not embroidery, but handwork was crochet work, which along with Bharvi and the Suti became popular by 1910. Now, here are two examples of cross-continental crochet work, which was done around the same time. On the left is crochet work done by a lady in Arnoli, which is present Haryana, around 1920 to 1930. And on the right is around 1920s, but done by a lady in Slovenia in Europe. And you can yourself see the similarities in the roses and in the edging, which is very, very evident. And what is amazing is that how is it that around the same time people made similar kind of designs? One can say that in Punjab or in other parts of India, when girls or people traveled from one place to another, they could have seen the embroidery and then copied it. But here in the cross-continental scenario, it is evident that there were a lot of designs which were printed around this time. And since India was part of colonial British India, we readily got came out in Europe, readily came to India, and we got it pretty soon, and hence the similarity. So I come to an end of my slides. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Jaswinder. I think for many who haven't read the book, this would definitely tempt you to buy the book. And I would tell each one of you, please go ahead and buy the book. You will not be disappointed. And for those who have already got the book, it's a nice kind of way to look at it through Jaswinder's eyes, what has been her favorite. Now, what is very interesting for me is that Jaswinder has done a very, very personalized story of each and every aspect in her book, whether it's the sewing machine which her mother had, whether it was the pulling work that her mother was doing embroidery with, and as young people, they had to help their mother. But what I'm very interested in asking Jaswinder is that she's wearing a lovely pulkari, and I don't see mention of the changes of what was happening with the pulkari at this time. Was it a deliberate omission on your part because pulkari was still being embroidered and you've given, or were you wanting deliberately to talk only of the European and the English influence on embroidery? And secondly, the big panjadaris, the big weaving tradition which was happening, and a lot of that was happening in colonial India too. So I'm just wondering, did you want to limit, would it have become too bulky, or you wanted to be very, very specific about what you were wanting to put in the book?
Yes, I wanted to be specific. And for me, pulkaris and daris, they might have been influenced to a very small extent by way of maybe some colors or designs, especially in pulkari, in the three styles that are associated with pulkari, like the bag and the sanchi pulkari and the chop. The other two, the bag and the chop, to my mind, are very little, could not be influenced to a very large extent. But some amount of influence in the Sanchi Pulkari, which is figurative Pulkari, was there by way of designs. Like they were added, like when they often used to call Mame and Mame Saab and Sahabs, when they visited the villages, then they were added, women added them to their designs. Or when the trains first came, then they added them. But then I was limiting my study to which was directly European. So in that sense, that's why I did not include it.
Okay. So, actually on page 42, you write a very interesting thing when you said that when I traveled abroad for the first time in the 80s, I realized that my husband had more shopping to do than me. That was primarily because my way of dressing was Indian, while his basic style was Western. Being a bureaucrat, he wore suits, trousers, and shirts, and the dress of those in the civil service since the Raj. On the other hand, most women like me, especially from Punjab, wore either shalwar kameezes or saris. Now, you also write in the next line saying, during the British period, the traditional dress of the Indian woman did not undergo drastic changes, and to a large extent, this has not happened even now. Would you like to, tell us a little more about this? Because I think the salwar kameez has now become an international dress. From Punjab, you have everybody, say from Sherry Blair to the American first ladies. At some point or the other, they've worn the traditional shalwar kameez and dupatta, which is part of the Punjabi attire. So while at one point you say that this did not go the kind of change which the petticoat and the blouse you've mentioned about Rabindranath Tagore and Gyan Nandini, and the fact that how the blouse was an import from the British and the petticoats came from there. how would you say that, when you were traveling abroad, you didn't have, so much of kind of a dichotomy in your attire?
Yes, that's true, because traditionally, now there are two things we are referring to. Firstly, we are talking about, I'm in my book talking about European influence on the Indian or the Punjabi attire. So if I take that line, then the attire of the Punjabi women did not drastically change, in the sense that we did not start to wear trousers, or at least I've also mentioned that some upper class or royalty did wear. But generally, most women in Punjab did not do that. But their influences were by way of wearing a manner of tying a sari, or using materials, for instance. Materials came from abroad. And I also talk about the colors that changed in an indirect way when styles changed abroad, and the same materials came to India in an indirect way. Women adopted those materials, and they, in an indirect way, changed their colors and the patterns. That's one. And then coming to the sari. See, in 19th century, sari was considered a single piece of garment. And it was generally muslin. And even in 1866, when Watson, in his J. Forbes Watson, he writes about sari in his volume, Textiles and Manufacture, Textile Manufacture in the Costumes and Textiles of India. He mentions that petticoat is worn by some. So he also says that petticoat was considered as an impure garment. And many women who had started, who were wearing petticoat, or some women who were wearing petticoat, would often remove it while eating, praying, or cooking, etc. Now, this tradition of wearing an unstitched garment for even praying, or even for some of the rituals of religious rituals of even wedding rituals, in some communities still there even today. But coming back to petticoat, a petticoat was adopted, as I mentioned, the crinoline by end of 19th century, was these huge voluminous dresses which were worn by women. So which coincided, this period coincided with the American Civil War. And this is beautifully depicted in the movie Gone with the Wind, where Scarlett O'Hara wears beautiful, huge volumes of dresses and many layers of petticoat. So when women of that period, or the Europeans, were in India, and they were wearing large number of petticoats, the saris changed, and women adopted, added petticoat and blouse to their sari. Now, there's a story that comes with it, that although it's not by certain whether Rabindranath Tagore's sister-in-law, she started it, but she certainly popularized it. And she was a wife of Satyendra Tagore, who was the first ICS officer, or Indian Civil Service officer of India. And he probably they had to interact with the Europeans, since at that point of time, the sari was just a muslin piece of cloth which was worn. It was difficult for women to be out and socializing with people. So a blouse adapted from the 1860s dresses, which was form-fitting, and a petticoat from that time was added. And they say then by 1867 or 68, when Satyendra Tagore's wife visited the Viceroy's reception, she had worn probably this kind of new form of tying a sari. And you know, Rabindranath Tagore also mentions it in Viswa Bharati Journal of 1940, that his sister-in-law had popularized this style of tying a sari.
Yeah, and I think on page 63, you've given a lovely picture of a lady from a rich landlord family in Firozpur, where she's wearing a fur coat with a sari. So I suppose that's one of the things which you are highlighting, how the the influence of the colonial masters in a certain way brought in was being either mimicked or through functionality, because it's warm, and in India the bitter winds, we used to just drape a shawl. So you have this lady with her husband wearing a lovely sari with a Banarsi border and a fur coat. But what is also very interesting is that I really loved your image in the beginning, which you had also shown, that how the coat, the coat which was brought in by the British, became a kind of a ubiquitous garment for people from all walks of life, whether they wore trousers, formal trousers, or they wore a lungi below it, or they wore pajamas, or anything, but the coat becomes their kind of marker of modern identity. These are very, very interesting things. There is a host of questions which I would have liked to ask you, particularly about the different kind of lace that you have, the jewelry that you attempted. You've got beautiful subtitles here, and also the whites, in the embroidery section. But I think we must give our very engaged audience also a chance to ask questions. I don't want to hog up all your time. So Preeti, could you kind of filter that and, pose the questions, because I think we have I've tried to keep to the time. We have about 10 to 12 minutes for a question answer. And
thanks, Alka. Thank you. I'll ask a few of the questions which have been coming in. Artika Bakshi is asking, what inspired this book? How many years of research and planning?
What inspired the book is because it's very relevant, colonial influence is very relevant today. Men are wearing trousers and shirts and ties, bureaucracies wearing achkans and bankala, and we have adopted the achkans and the bankala coat as a formal Indian dress, which the Indian government officials wear to official receptions and to even embassies functions abroad. So what inspired me really, what inspired me really was that when I was in Switzerland, I was working in Musée d'Art d'Histoire. I was working on a chapter of Indian influence on Western textiles, which I wrote with how the Indian textiles in the 17th century invaded Europe, and they had come there and influenced and helped set up the European textile industry, inspired the European textile industry, which was not there, printing and textile industry, which was not there before that. So at that time, a lot of my colleagues used to pose me this question, that what were the Western influences on Indian textiles? And the obvious answer was my husband's attire. But Other than that, I could not give too many answers. So since that time, I had this in mind that I had to, it was like a long-term goal for me, and that I had to undertake this study. So as far as the research goes, it took me 5 years to complete the research, more so because all these, the most of the matter that is there is from people's homes. And Indian museums do not focus on these kind of attires and textiles, and they focus more on pulkaris and to some extent daris. So I contacted people, and people opened their sanduks and petis and their hearts, and they welcomed me. So it was long but very fulfilling experience.
Thank you. Labor of love.
Labor of love.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So there's another question. Do Good in 1874 wrote about India and commented on the clothing worn in Punjab, but was disparaging about women in terms of looks and the jewelry they wore. Elsewhere, I have come across texts written by colonial writers being negative, stating Punjabi women do not fully cover their bodies. My question is, did the British influence and promote conservative Victorian attire in Punjab, especially for women?
I'm not so sure. Alka is more in a position to answer that, but I'm not sure it was colonial influence, because it had, before that there was Mughal also, right? So covering the attire, I think they were covering before that also, before the colonial period.
Alka, you want to add to that?
What I would feel is that Punjab had its very, very strong identity, which was also hybrid. So I wouldn't like to say that they were exposing. That is the way the women wore their clothing, and so did the men. If you see that pre British in the Punjab, most of them wore a kurta and a lungi,
Yes.
or a shalwar. They always did wear a kind of a covering on the head, on their there was also, before the lungi came, there were certain places where they also wore a ghagara, which was from the neighboring states. So I wouldn't really like to say that they were not adequately.
Plus also the Mughal paintings and even the paintings of the earlier period depict women fully clothed.
I think I wouldn't put it like that. I would just definitely say, even if you look at the Sikh paintings, there is a huge thing of the Sikh miniature paintings. There was a great Central Asian influence. What could be that they started wearing stitched, the women, the churidars and the shalwars became very much part of it. And maybe a little later, the kurtis became a little more fitted. Maybe the form was showing a little more, but I don't think they were underclothed ever in any way. No.
Yes.
So there's another question. Padmini Mongia is asking about pulkari and how that was impacted by Western encounter. Did threads change? Did the stitches change? And you did talk a little bit about it earlier. And also the case. She says that I know you said it's not part of the encounter, but still, if you can add to it.
So in, I think pulkari, there's a style called Sanchi pulkari, which is figurative and it has motives. And I think the designs changed more than the style. And I'm not very confident about the stitches and all changing too much. I think the stitches have remained so for a very long period of time. And the case, of course, I did mention that there's one writer that writes about that it was influenced by Jin Jam, but I don't know. I'm not so sure about that either. So a case was, I think, pretty much even the earlier paintings and all show case, wearing men wearing checked case of even earlier period.
Preeti, can I just add to the
Yeah,
Phulkari
please.
bit?
Yeah.
Well, I would definitely say that the material changed, definitely, as Jaswinder would agree with me. From the case, it went also into georgettes and chignons and, uh, as they call it, pure da dupatta, etc. Earlier, it was done on cotton muslin case. But definitely during the colonial period, the thematics changed quite a lot. Many of them became social commentaries. They also became a bit subversive and political, very few of them. But because Pulkari was more about the dowry and the dreams which women wove on the fabric, which they would then take as wari to their own homes. So basically, of course, there were the beautiful patterns and the gateways and all that. But a very small percent did become socially more active and also a bit subversive, very few of them, but thematics definitely changed. And the designs also became a little more modern and contemporary, though the Pulkari still remains and retains the structure of the beautiful colors of the earth and the fuchsia, pink and yellow and green.
Yes, just to add a little bit about that. Now, since we're covering the British period, I think in the British period, the material did not change. It is only after independence that more modern material came in, because women stopped, spinning and making khaddar, because that was the material for the pulkari, as it was the material for making other materials like lungi and susi and that sort of thing.
Sakshi has asked about Fulkari only, about Fulkari and what's the difference between Fulkari from Punjab and Fulkari from Haryana. And then we have some other comments on photographs of Western dress and how that had, women in Punjab were picking that up, especially women from the royal families. Do you want to talk about the difference in the Fulkari styles?
Well, see, Pulkari is actually Gulkari, which came from Iran, they say. And there are bits of Pulkari even in Rajasthan, Haryana, Punjab. And there are a few differences, of course, definitely regional differences. But the stitchcraft basically remains the same.
And there were three styles. The one that was in which the ground did not show was called bag. Then there was a chope which had triangular patterns, radiating inward. That was called chope. And then there was the sanchi, which had figures which were embroidered with influenced by the motif. And just I want to add another thing to the pulkari, since this material was made by women, was spun by the women on the charkha. It was woven by the local julaha. And since the width of the julaha, the loom, was small, in most of the textiles, whether it is a case or a pulkari, you always see a joint in the middle. Because I think the width of the loom was, because of space constraint, they had a smaller width in their homes.
So your pulkari is also a bag and a mix of chope stitches, Jaswinder. You can show
Mine is a more modern. Mine is a modern one.
Yeah, but it has the thing, yeah.
Yeah, it's a more like a bag.
Lovely color.
So next question, Kanika Sachdeva is asking, while most textile historians have the same opinion about Indian sari petticoats, as adoption of Western influences, why can't you explore the fact that it could be an adaptation of the lenga skirts worn in India? And is there any evidence that rules this out? And that is also followed by a later question from Sunaina Suneja saying, can you tell us about the wearing of the ghagra and when it went out of style in Punjab?
So the first question, if we take it that it is from lenga, then what about the word petticoat and a blouse? Now, everyone from a dhobi to a maid to a tailor use the word petticoat and a blouse, and that's self-explanatory. Now, as far as the ghagra goes, ghagra was worn till sometime after independence, and in different regions, different parts of Punjab, including Haryana. In some parts of Haryana, maybe it's still worn. And in Punjab, there was a tradition of wearing ghagra or kagra, as we call it, while women went out of the house. When women were in the house, they did not wear it, but they wore it over their salwar and their and while they were going out, they wore it. But with independence, with the shortage of cloth, and it going out of style, I think slowly first in the cities and then in the villages, it went out of style.
So I think we have one more question from Padmini Mongia. It would also be interesting to hear one of you comment on looms and weaving. Changes in looms and who did the weaving must have impacted clothing as well.
In Punjab or?
In Punjab as well as, I mean, basically she is talking about the impact that might have had, the size of the looms and who did the weaving.
Yeah, because see, it was restricted to the space in the house. The size was restricted to that. And then later on, the power looms came, so which became more, it was a different story then. And now it's more, see, earlier the loom, the women made the yarn. The basic process was done by women by separating the cotton from the seeds and then making what they call poonies, balls, and then making yarn. Then after the yarns were made, it was given to the dyer to dye the yarn or woven, or woven straight. So then it was given to Julahana. Every second, third village in Punjab had a Julaha or a dyer. Every village did not have a Julaha. So they gave it to them to weave. So weaving was very integrated part of Punjab. But after independence, when in a lot of cases, the weavers and dyers were Muslim, that really changed the way handloom industry was there in Punjab, and it's really sad the way it's happening now.
I think it's really been an interesting presentation as well as conversation, and that's what a lot of the chat box is full of wonderful comments about the conversation and everything that people seem to have learned from this, all the information that you've also been giving us. And a lot of people are also reminiscing about their own homes and parents and grandparents and their homes with the, similar kind of tablecloths and embroideries and so on. So this is really lovely. I think with that, we come to the end of this session, and I'm going to ask Professor Gurupdesh Singh to please be there to give us the formal thank yous. And from my side, thank you both very much.
Thank you, Preeti.
Guru Updesh.
Yeah, thank you very much, Preeti and Jaswinder and Alka. What a load of information I think these two ladies have been able to give us. I think you're right. Yes, it has reminded us of many old days when my mother or our grandmothers used to talk about those clothes. One interesting thing that I noticed was that as a teacher of English or as a teacher of literature, we have been talking about post-colonial issues. And most of the time we have been discussing the political things or the issues of identity or other kind of conflicts. But here is an important area of post-colonial studies where I think people could even go back and see how the colonial masters influenced our attire also, and in a way also the kind of designs or the machines that we have used for weaving those clothes. Another thing that I was thinking of when I was listening to you was that lots of words that you have used, both Jaswinder as well as Dr. Alka, they have been transformed in a strange way into our own Punjabi language. For example, you use the word waistcoat, which has become waskat in Punjabi. And Alka used the word chinan, which is shanoon. If you remember when I was young, they used to call it. And that also reminded me of a number of other words like, cheat, if you remember. Cheat is also probably from English word. And crepe and poplin and chemise also, for example, has also come from those. Of all the things I think which most of us do not know, that even the word banyan or banyan is also from the British attires they used to wear. One word which I was very amused to remember was that when I was young, my mother was very fond of wearing a fabric called Lady Minton. Lady Minton was, it must be Lady Milton, I guess, because they were used to wear. So good, you reminded us of all these things.
And also, sorry to interrupt, and also parachute cloth.
Yes, I think, yes, there must be a number of other clothes as well as designs, I think, which safari, for example, today that many people wear also comes from chiffon. Yash Chopra is so fond of chiffon. That also comes. So in a way, I think you have sent us back to our old days and told us how, in a way, I think I wasn't feeling good that what we are wearing is not our dress. We have borrowed it all from other other sources. But anyway, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much for informing us all. And I think it was a great session. I think things like you can see the chat box. It's full of great compliments to both of you. And I think lots of our audience is also going to read this book. They are very keen on buying this book. Thank you very much for inspiring us all. And I think gracing this Maja House session.